So please let yourself sit comfortably and at ease and listen tonight. And listening to teachings is a meditation in itself, not because you're supposed to believe anything, and there's no exam at the end, although there is a lovely poem I've read that begins, "In the evening you will be examined on love." So there's a real exam for us. But instead, you listen to see if what is spoken has any resonance in your heart to what you already know, to what you know to be true. And the rest of it you can just let go by. And in the course of this year, over these 12 months, I've been doing a series of teachings on Buddha nature and on the awakened heart and the awakened mind. And tonight is a particular quality where we're kind of getting through the list. You know, the Buddha was a list maker. The 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 5 skandhas and the 6 paramitas and the 7 factors of enlightenment and so forth. Anyway, and we talked in previous months about these qualities which are really inherent to the heart of generosity and integrity, of wisdom and patience, of renunciation. And next month it will be loving kindness. That will be a juicy one before Christmas and the holidays. Tonight it's a different quality, and I think an important one, given that we live, at least some of us, in hard times, outwardly, inwardly. And so this is the quality called, in Sanskrit, called adhitthana, which means determination, dedication, commitment, resolve. And it is one of the qualities that come out of our loving awareness. It is inherent to the heart when we discover who we really are. I mean, who are we? How did you get born into this body and mind? It is really mysterious. And then how do we live wisely, given the fact that we find ourselves in a human incarnation? Now, I'm also aware that this is the night before Halloween. One of my favorite memories from Monday night, when we had our temporary buildings for 25 years in the meadow over there, those of you who are here, those modular trailers, was a Halloween night in the 1990s when we had the guest visit of the monks from one of the, it might have been Ganden or Shartsi monastery, Gyuto Tantric Choir, the guys who go, oh, and you get all those multivocal, you know, they chant this whole chord, oh, I can't really quite do it. But anyway, so they came in and they were going to chant for us, and the abbot put his forehead against mine. I guess it was some beautiful transmission or something like that. It was cool, actually. It was fun. And so they were going to chant for us. It was lovely. And then I noted to them that it was Halloween, and the moon was almost full. And I talked a little bit about Halloween to these lamas, you know, and the costumes that people wear. And they said, oh, we have costumes. They were in a van. And they pulled out all these skeleton costumes. And we went out into the meadow over there under the moonlight, and they did the skeleton dance of the dead on Halloween. And I thought, okay, whoever's central casting, this is perfect, thank you. You know. So Buddhist teaching is full of ghost stories. And when I lived in the monasteries in the forests of Thailand and places in Burma, there's not only lots of stories of ghosts, but there's a really palpable fear of ghosts. And it's like it's part of everybody's daily experience in some way or other, to be wary of or to try to propitiate or make sure the ghosts are happy or things like that. And of course, being a young and rude Westerner at the monastery, I said, ghosts? Who believes in ghosts? You know, and I went and sat out in the charnel ground all night, say, okay, come on, bring it on, ghosts, whatever. And I didn't see anything. And they used to tease me about it. They said they saw your white skin and they ran away or something like that, you know. Or maybe it was my big nose and they ran away, something like that. But there were so many stories, and my teacher's teacher was this very famous monk, and Laos used to go around, as Milarepa did, in the areas where people were frightened by spirits. And there are all these stories of him going into caves and being confronted by this huge demon. And he looked at the demon and he said, "You think you're powerful? You don't even know who you are." And the demon says, "Huh?" He said, "Yeah, your power is really crude. You don't have any power over karma or dharma or anything important. It's just crude power. Do you want to know something?" And the demon got interested and he said, "All right, I'll teach you. I'll teach you how to meditate," and so forth. So there are all those kind of stories. But I'll tell you a more modern ghost story just because they're true. A good friend of mine who was a monk for a time in Burma became the director of one of the largest hospices in America. He worked with Ram Dass for a long time too. And one day, a family in the morning came to see him, and they said, "Our father is close to dying." Their dad was in his mid-80s, but we have a dilemma. His younger brother, who was 79, was killed in a car accident yesterday, and we don't know whether to tell him, because he's very close to dying and it would upset him. What should we do? And so hospice director friend said, "Well, let's go and see how your dad's doing." And they walk in the room and he's lying there and he's his last day or two, very weak, and "Hi, Dad," and they pay attention to him and so forth. And then he raises his head, he says, "Don't you have something to tell me?" And they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "My brother died." They're shocked. They said, "How do you know?" He said, "Oh, I've been talking to him all night long." So, who are we? Really, who are you? What do you think you're made of? Do you think you're this body made of whatever it is, hamburgers or kale or whatever your diet is? I mean, come on, you know. There's something much more mysterious about life than we ordinarily touch. And I love this beautiful passage from Annie Dillard from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, written years ago, where she says, "The secret of seeing the pearl of great price, I would stagger barefoot across hundreds of deserts after any lunatic at all if he could help me to find it. But although the pearl may be found, it may not be sought. It always comes as a revelation, a gift, a surprise." And she says, and then you see what was ordinarily before your eyes pulsing with light. It's filled with light. She says it's possible in deep space to sail on light, the light of the solar wind. Particle or wave, it has a force. You rig a giant sail and you go. And the secret of seeing is to sail on solar wind. Hone and spread your spirit till you yourself are a sail, wedded, translucent, broadside to the merest puff, illuminated by the light. So we do live in this mystery, and things are glowing with life. And actually, anything that you look at doesn't quite exist that way. Your brain really creates it. The eyeball is always moving. You know, it's not like a camera that just gets an image. It's actually always fluctuating, and then the colors that go on the retina and go up through the optic nerve to that, part of the brain really constructs what you see. So what is it to be alive, and who are we in this mystery? And if we take that as a kind of deep spiritual question, then this quality of adhitthana, or dedication or determination, becomes a question, to what are we dedicated? And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts with security, food, clothing, and shelter, social needs, and at the top is the spiritual needs. But it often can be reversed, so that when you look at Viktor Frankl, coming out of the concentration camps, he said, "We who lived through the concentration camps can remember those who walked through the huts, comforting others and giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they showed the greatest and truest reality of human spirit of all, the possibility to choose your spirit no matter what the circumstance. And you see it in his life, you see it in the life of people like Nelson Mandela or others who, in spite of not having, whether it's security or food or whatever, that the spirit is really what they lived from and for. That's what they were dedicated to. And so we begin to reflect in our own way in spiritual life, what are we dedicated to on our own values? And of course, there's a kind of conundrum because a lot of spiritual teachings talk about non-attachment, which is a very good thing. Being attached and grasping doesn't make people happy. You may have noticed that when you get attached to your children being a certain way, for example. They don't necessarily want to be the way you want them to be. They want to be themselves. The same with your partners. You may have noticed that as well. But how does dedication and determination, resolve, commitment work with non-attachment? The game is somehow to remember your true nature, to remember that you are consciousness, that you're loving awareness. But as my dear friend Ram Dass likes to put it, he says, remember your Buddha nature and your social security number, right? That there is actually multiple dimensions of our experience. And if you only remember your social security number, you're in trouble, plus which it was stolen last week anyway, so you're in more trouble. But if you also only think, oh yeah, it's all light and holy, and don't drive on the right side of the street, you'll be in trouble. Story from Robert Johnson, Jungian analyst, the author of He, She, We, all these little wonderful mythological books. He said, years ago when I was in rural India, before it got modernized, I was quite sick with a high fever and great pain. The man at the hospital, they took me to a hospital, and the man at the hospital must have seen my apprehension because he tried to assure me that they were a very modern facility. We have a thermometer, the nurse reassured me. I later found that they had one thermometer that they passed from patient to another, and in between they held it under the water faucet. My temperature reached 105. I had terrible diarrhea and cramps. Somehow after 10 days I survived. The bill was $28. While I was hospitalized, my new friend from the village where I had come to live, Shankar, came every evening to visit me and slept every night on the floor under my bed. Of all my experiences in India over the next 20 years, this was perhaps the most touching. When I was sick, my friend slept near me so that I wouldn't be frightened or lonely, or to see if I needed anything. Now in America, if I get sick, I can't get anyone to stay with me for very long, not to speak of sleep under my bed. But here Shankar came and not only slept on the mat, but tended me. And then one day he stood at the foot of the bed and said, Robert, I want to tell you a story about Baba and his friend. This friend got very sick, and Baba came and stood behind him and said, only say the word, and I will go to die so you can live. Robert, for you, I am Baba. You only have to say the word, and I will die in our friendship so that you can be better. It was like one of those stories out of the Scheherazade and the 1001 Nights. At first I was shocked by this. How can you hold that kind of an offer? But I had the presence of mind to say, thank you, Shankar, for this great gift. Please don't do anything rash now. I think I have enough vitality left in me that both of us continue to live. And I did. But I never forgot the depth of the tie and the profundity of the relationship implied by this generosity I had never seen or known before. And so here we are, these translucent beings with consciousness, but also tending one another in this human form. And so if it's not attachment, then what is it? It's dedication, it's love, it's connection. I talk about this when I have done weddings for people. If you're attached to the way a person's supposed to be, you will eventually get in conflict. I need you to be this way and you need to do this for me. It doesn't run very well as a relationship. But if instead you are committed to love, to care, to bless, to offer, foster your support to one another, not with expectations, but with a steadiness of heart, it changes everything. When people love us with a steadiness, when we love with a steadiness, it changes everything. Tony Murden, if you know what it means to be out in the middle of an ocean by yourself in the dark, scared, then it gives you a feel for what every other human being is going through. She's the first woman to row solo across the Atlantic Ocean. I rowed an actual ocean. Other people have just as many obstacles to go through. So dedication. And what does it mean as human beings to be dedicated? And to what to become dedicated? Dedication is really an expression of the awakened heart that says this life that I experience, this embodied life, has certain things that I value that really matter. And rather than saying, I should be this way, this is what I care about. And of course you learn it, or you can find this quality supported by your training in meditation. So Zen Master Suzuki Roshi writes, suppose your children are suffering from a hopeless disease. You don't know what to do. You can't lie in bed. Normally the most comfortable place for you would be a warm, comfortable bed. You pace up and down, in and out, but this doesn't help. Actually, the best way to relieve your mental suffering is to sit in meditation, even in such a confused state of mind. If you have no experience of sitting in this kind of difficult situation, you're not yet a true meditation student. No other activity will appease your suffering. In a continuous practice under a succession of agreeable and disagreeable situations, you will realize the marrow of meditation and acquire its true strength. And so it's not that one practices in order to have a particular experience, but rather to learn this capacity to be present for the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows that make up human life. Now I saw just last night the film Jane at the Raffel Theater about Jane Goodall, and if you haven't seen it, it's really quite marvelous. They found 100 hours of film that was shot in the 1960s of her by her husband, who was a brilliant and celebrated filmmaker, that they thought had been lost for a long time, and used this to make a film. So you see a lot of her going there to Gombe and beginning to try to watch what chimps were doing, and no one had ever done it in the wild before, at least not Europeans, not white folks. I'm sure that there were African people who lived there who knew the lives of chimpanzees much better, but no scientists, no researchers prior. And the thing that you see in it was how long it took her to make a relationship with the chimps. There were no dating apps, we couldn't swipe on it or anything. And she had to trape through the rain and sit under the bushes, and they would run away each time, and she would just sit there, and she did it again and again and again and again for months and months and months. She was asked, didn't you get frustrated? She said, I did. But Dr. Louis Leakey, who hired her, found that she had a considerable quality of patience. She said, I just knew that if I stayed long enough and still enough at some point, we could start to relate. And they did. It's a beautiful account of this. Your capacity to be present is larger than you know, because your awareness is larger than you know. It contains everything. You are spirit itself. You are consciousness born into this body. And you also carry within you in your DNA generations of ancestors who've survived everything. You are a survivor. It's there in your... you have strength, you have courage, you have stamina. And even people who are weak and sick and so forth, when it comes down to it, often there's a kind of rousing of amazing strength that you can see. It's just there in you. And I think about my grandparents and great-grandparents who I knew several of my great-grandparents quite well, because they lived to their 90s, and so I knew them into my 20s, and they'd come over on boats in the 1890s. As teenagers, they left Russia or Ukraine or places where there'd been pogroms and anti-Semitism and so forth, left their families, came as teens, knew they would never go back, and they did that, It's not like moving from Marin over to Berkeley or something like that, I mean, there are generations of human beings who have survived and struggled and brought life to you in the form that you are. And you carry this in you. So this is part of what it means to awaken, to realize and recognize this. So I'm also aware of how many people have in our neighborhood been affected by the fires. How many people lost their homes, or have people close to you who lost homes and places in fire? I know you're here. Yeah, so many, dozens, and many, many, many more. Story, I was a reporter at the Sarasota newspaper in Florida, where as a cub reporter, I spent a lot of time covering fires. One day, I parked my car behind the police line reporters were supposed to stop at, and walked around till I found a way into the wooded area where the woods were blazing. Helicopters flew overhead, the pilots swooping low to fill buckets with water from a pond and drop them onto the blaze. And we all know this from what's happened recently so much. With the fire sweeping across hundreds of acres, firefighters were focusing on directing the course of the fire rather than attempting to put it out, and limiting injuries by instructing people still in their homes to evacuate. However, there was one woman, Mrs. Rosa Garcia, whose house I happened to be standing beside, who simply refused to go. Her husband was at work, her children at school, and she stood in her yard with a hose in one hand and a kitchen broom in the other. Alone with the fire no more than a few yards away, she sprayed the back of her house and roof with water and clutched the broom in preparation to fight off any flames that came near. A moment later, the fire crossed the back line to her property, approached her house, and then jumped it because she had hosed it down. Because she had stayed, the flames did not catch on. Now, it's not to say everybody could have done that, because there were those huge winds that you couldn't have. But in this story, you could. When she dropped off her kids at school that morning, when she said goodbye to her husband, she'd had no idea what she would do or what she would be capable of doing that day. From the outside, she looked like a completely ordinary woman home on a Wednesday afternoon doing her household chores until the kids returned. But on this day, she defied the authorities who told her to leave, stood in the line of a tremendous fire, stood her ground, armed with no more than a hose and a broom, and saved her home. I think of this woman often, not because she was a heroine on the order of Martin Luther King or Rachel Carlson, but because she was an ordinary person who was able to find remarkable strength in herself. And if she could do it, then doesn't that have a promise for all of us? So this is really what this quality is about, and somehow awakening to this. And of course, we can learn it in certain ways in meditation. And the training I did in the monasteries, we would sit up all night, and sit long sittings and not move, and walk barefoot in the morning 10 miles to get our food and stuff like that. There were sort of endurance things, and monks who made vows to not lie down for a year and things like that. Okay. All these austerities, live in caves and things like that. That's the stuff young men like to do, kind of test themselves, right? I mean, it is, is there anything tough to do around here, right? Now, of course, that's the hero's myth. The myth for women is quite different, For example, I think about when my daughter was born, and my ex-wife went into labor, and her labor lasted almost 3 days, because the the contractions happened, but my daughter's head wasn't quite engaged, so there kept to being contractions, but her cervix wouldn't dilate. We'd go to the hospital, and they'd say, no, go home. And 3 days and nights, it was like some monastic practice on steroids, basically, right? And Joseph Campbell wrote about it when he wrote about the hero's journey. He said, mostly men's initiation is to try to find out, to try to seek or discover for men what's quite natural for women. So just to understand that. And whether it's giving birth or in the feminine giving birth to other things in the world, there's a whole different way of understanding that comes through having a female body. But even so, the gift underneath is to look to see, who are we really? And I just came back from traveling in China for a few weeks with my beloved Trudy. We taught in a 1,200-year-old Zen temple there, and the abbot, who was very open to modern forms of mindfulness teaching and Western psychology and trauma work, because there's an enormous amount of trauma in the community around the temple, and how that fit together with Buddhist psychology. So it's actually very creative. But anyway, there we are in this 1,000-year-old temple, and giant temple, lots of buildings, and in this big Buddha hall there are pictures on the walls of the great ancestors. Hui Neng, the sixth patriarch, and Matsu, it was his temple, all these great patriarchs, so to speak. And Trudy says at one point, she says, I'd like to teach a meditation that, as far as I know, has never been taught in the land of China in thousands of years, so please close your eyes. Everyone closes their eyes. And you say, I'd like you to now visualize, it was a visualization, that you enter this great and august Dharma hall, and you look on the walls, and you see the pictures of all the ancestors, and they're all women. The great, Zen ancestors of thousands of years. And then you look up in the front of the hall, and you see the abbess, who's always a woman, over generations, surrounded by all of her chief disciples, also who are women, just because it's a bit easier to get enlightened in a woman's body. That's so. But men also can be enlightened, and we've saved a place for you in the back of the room. But also, we'd like to ask if you wouldn't mind helping in the kitchen afterward. And it will be helpful to you, because then you will be able to make enough merit that perhaps in a future life you can be born in a woman's body. The women in the room were all grinning like this, right? And the abbot actually appreciated it. He had a good sense of humor about it all. And more than that, he understood that there was something that needed to change. But we live in a society that in a way wants to put us to sleep. Not in a way. Read this many times. The best adjusted person in a modern society is the person who's not dead and not alive, just numb, a zombie. When you're dead, you're not able to work for the society. But if you're fully alive, you constantly say no to many of the unhealthy processes of the society. The racism, the polluted environment, the nuclear threat, the arms race, drinking unsafe water, eating carcinogenic foods. Thus, it's in the interest of modern society to promote those things that take the edge off, keep us busy with our fixes, and keep us slightly numbed out and zombie-like. In this way, our modern consumer society itself functions as an addict. And you can hear it, great dilemmas, maybe you should go shopping, right? So there's this force that wants to put us to sleep in some way, and yet there's another possibility, and we all know it because it is who we are. And when we sit and walk, practice meditation, do loving kindness practice or compassion practice and so forth, the point in some way is to remember that who we are is spirit, that we have a possibility to choose our freedom in any given circumstance. But it has this odd kind of paradox, because even though it's always here, it also flowers with our dedication. And so, just as raindrops one by one fill the water jar, so with care and dedication, fill your life with goodness. And this is a verse from the Dhammapada of the Buddhist teachings, that moment by moment or drop by drop, both you can awaken, but also somehow you begin to transform your body, your heart, your mind, your consciousness. Or otherwise, you live on automatic pilot. As Julia Child writes, in department stores, so much unnecessary kitchen equipment is bought indiscriminately by people who had just come in for men's underwear, right? And so you can get kind of seduced by the culture that says this will make you happy. And what happens in deep meditation, for those, I just finished teaching a retreat with Trudy and a whole group of wonderful teachers here at Spirit Rock, is that sometimes when you get very still, the mind becomes clear and luminous. The body can dissolve into light. You have experiences of profound stillness or vastness of mind. And then certain qualities in consciousness arise, which are described in Buddhist psychology as the malleability and pliancy of consciousness. And what it means is that when you become really centered and stable, you can place your attention somewhere and it just stays. It's like a well-trained dog. Sit, stay, okay. You can turn your attention to a state or to a quality, and even more interesting, you can call up different qualities, and the psyche or the whatever you want to call it, the storehouse consciousness, will allow them to arise. And you might say in a very deep place, may this consciousness be filled with joy. And it's like a video game or something. The body and mind just gets filled with ecstatic joy. Okay, too much, dial it down. And the possibilities of playing in the realms of consciousness, the yogic possibilities, are really kind of fantastic and wonderful. And then, of course, there's the laundry, right? As you know from that book title, After the Ecstasy, the laundry. Those remind you, they show you who you are, which is a being of consciousness. You are loving awareness born into this body, a being of light. But then, as you learn that, the next task is to remember it, to embody it. And you don't have to have those experiences, because we've all had experiences in walking in the mountains or making love or listening to a magnificent piece of music or sitting at the bedside of someone who's dying in that mystery, or there when someone's being born, or taking sacred medicine, or 100 other ways that open us. We know we're not just this body. And as we remember and as we meditate to remember and reawaken, that becomes more the way that we rest and move through the world. And the beautiful thing is that it's never too late to awaken, to remember, never too late to start over. The man was my age, but looked many years older. He was an army vet. He was also homeless, cold, and hungry. I could see he'd tried to wash up before coming to the social service department to ask for help. His face and hands were clean, but his clothes were filthy. And though he claimed not to have had any alcohol that day, the smell of it seeped from his pores. I wanted to get him into rehab, and I asked if he was ready to come in off the streets. "No, ma'am," he said. "All I'd like is a few dollars and some bus tickets. If I can get sober enough, they'll let me into the shelter across town." The shelter had 50 beds, cots really. The homeless were admitted at night and forced out at dawn to eat breakfast at a nearby charity. 50 beds and nearly 1,000 homeless in this small city alone. And that is really one of the shames of our culture, you know. It really is. It's something for us to tend to. Winter here in Northern California can mean cold rain and mud. And even though this man and many like him slept under bridges to keep dry, the dampness penetrated everything. His clothes and the bedroll he'd placed on the floor smelled moldy. The pages of a book he carried were swollen. I asked him how many times he'd tried rehab. 2 or 3 a long time ago, he said. Maybe it's time to try again. I explained I'd had a client who'd gone through the program 7 times before it took. Beside, I said, we're months away from warm weather. What else have you got going? I watched his face as he considered my offer. I thought I saw a flicker of hope in his eye, followed by a shadow of doubt. He'd tried before. It had been hard, impossibly hard. But so was living on the streets. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me. I reached for the phone. Shall I asked. He barely nodded yes. An hour later, I handed him over to a recovering alcoholic, also a veteran, who would drive him to one of the best rehab facilities in the county. Come visit me when you graduate, I said as they left. I barely recognized the man when he came into my office 6 months later, so tall and handsome, smelling like the outdoors, and holding a huge bouquet of flowers. So there's something about trusting, about seeing in each human being the dignity or the nobility, the possibility of awakening in every being. And that it's never too late to remember. And when you do, when you act with dedication and when you support that in another being, Goethe wrote about it. He said, when he talked about daring to dream, he said, when you dream and when you act, his ancient phrase translated was, providence moves with you, which is a way of saying the divine or the mystery. When you turn your energy or your love or your dedication to something, somehow the universe knows it. That same universe that made you and makes everything. And or as Helen Keller says, security is mostly a superstition. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. And so when you dare, when you direct yourself, when you're dedicated in some way, all kinds of surprising things happen with this. And your vision, your sense of the possibility of living in a freer way, of being awake, and the dedication are the key. Henry Moore, the great sculptor, writes, the secret of life is to have a task, a vision, something you devote your entire life to, and the most important thing is, it must be something you cannot possibly do. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So it's not so much, okay, you check the box off on your list. It's really something more magnificent and greater than that, and it's a willingness to turn the soil and the compost of your life into something beautiful. So Alan Chadwick was a famous gardener and one of the fathers of the modern ecological movement, who was a professor at the University of Santa Cruz. He gardened by growing soil to grow his plants. And what he meant by soil was different than the earth's surface. It meant a power in the universe that could be concentrated in gardening to capture cosmic magic. This was his kind of description of it. Chadwick grew soil and planted seeds based on the relationship that existed between the earth, its moon, the sun, the other planets, the weather, the way doves in the area coo, mist in the trees, and everything you could imagine. When winter was very bleak, he'd sing about the energies under the surface of the earth. Underneath, the seeds are full of life. This very moment, the seeds are waking up. They're pushing up to the sun. The doves are singing, coo, coo. So once Chadwick took a UC Santa Cruz class to a junkyard lot that was filled with rusted out cars, broken glass, chunks of cement, sand, and lots of abandoned trash. He asked the owner if his class could use the lot for an experiment to grow flowers and vegetables. The owner said, "Sure, but you are crazy. This soil is dead." The garden later became famous for its extraordinarily delicious vegetables and gorgeous flowers. They grew the soil and the plants followed. So having a vision, having a sense and a dedication to it, or as someone said, life shrinks and expands according to one's courage and dedication. That's how it works. And so in meditation, the same thing. You sit, and some days it's boring. Some days it opens you to something beautiful, and some days you're making lists and kind of checking them off in your mind even before you've started your day. That's fine. Or you're at the end of the day and you're doing reruns of your conversations and so forth. And some days it's much tougher than that. Some days it's beautiful. But the beautiful ones or the difficult ones, they're not really the point. This from Zen teacher Kornfield Durkheim. He writes, "The person who, being really on the way, falls upon hard times in the world will not, as a consequence, turn to that friend or those other friends who offer them refuge and support and comfort and encourage their old self to survive. Rather, they will seek out someone who will faithfully and inexorably help them to risk themselves so that they may endure the difficulty and pass courageously through it. Only to the extent that a person exposes themselves over and over again to annihilation can that which is indestructible be found within them. And in this daring lies dignity and the spirit of true awakening." And this is what you'll see, those of you who live in Santa Rosa and Napa Valley and, Sonoma and places from the fire. The fire seems to destroy everything. And yet out of it, also there is a spirit that grows. And I know it, the store is open and said, "What do you need? Come and take it." The neighbors come together and say, "We have and you don't share it with us." And there's a community spirit that comes in the difficulty that somehow illuminates the spirit in the hearts of everyone. In spite of racism, tribalism, environmental catastrophes, political divisiveness, all the kind of troubles that we see, the power of love and determination is that medicine, is that capacity that will, in the end, transform it, that can and will. Nothing else really has that capacity. There are, terrible things that happen in the world based on people who are unafraid to kill, based on violence and those who are willing to commit it. And the only force that is strong enough, that's powerful enough to meet that is the force of love. As Martin Luther King said when his church died, "We will meet your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering, and we will not hate you. We will wear you down by our capacity to love." Because in the end, we are connected, no matter what those who are frightened and those who fight say. We are connected. This is the truth. Now, traditionally, the kind of dedication to love or to care or to illumination, whatever your dedication might be, in Zen, it begins with a vow. Each time you do a sitting, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all. Dharmas are infinite, I vow to master them. Obstacles are endless, I vow to overcome them. These kind of vows, little vows. Or Shantideva's beautiful vows that I love to recite. The Dalai Lama says in the morning when he wakes up, "May I be a bridge, a boat, a raft to help all cross the flood. May I be food for the hungry. May I be medicine for the sick. May I be a resting place for the weary. May I be a lamp to illuminate the path in the darkness. And may I do so as long as sun and moon and stars and galaxies exist, until all beings are enlightened together. Amazing, beautiful, poetic vow. And what it speaks to is human spirit. What's possible for you to dedicate yourself to. And Napoleon said it at the end of his life. The thing that astonished me most, said Napoleon, is that the sword is always beaten by the spirit. It is always true. Here he was conquering all of Europe, for a time anyway, that the sword is always beaten by the spirit. So to what do you dedicate that spirit in your life? To love well? To be awake? What is it? Set your heart on gold, says Rumi. Set your heart on something really beautiful. Who are you, and what can you do with this life? Now, in Buddhist psychology, there is a lot of emphasis on the power of dedication and intention. Short-term intention means that as you go through your day, when you get into conflict or you have trouble making a decision or some struggle of some kind, take a pause, a mindful pause, a few breaths, and then simply ask yourself, what's my best intention? What's my highest intention? And very often, the whole tone of your conversation will change, because there you are trying to be right and, or get back at somebody or prove your point or whatever, and you pause for a moment, or it's in your email or your text before you send the little text thing, and you say, what's my highest intention? Oh, it's really to connect or to work this out or to find a way to love this person or listen or something beautiful. When you ask your heart, it usually answers that way. And then you reread the text and say, oh, I better change a few words there. And the whole tone changes. And when you press it, you get an entirely different response. Or in the conversation, the tone of your voice changes. You may not even say very much different, but it has the quality of respect or wanting to listen or to learn or to be open. And in that simple moment of quieting yourself and asking, what am I dedicated to? What is my best intention? Everything gets transformed. And in the same way, there is long-term intention. And that's like those bodhisattva vows that I just talked about, which is really setting the intention of your heart, like setting the compass for the direction of where you will go. This is from Wendell Berry, poet, farmer poet. He writes, "So, my friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the world. Work out of love for nothing. Love someone who doesn't deserve it. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Go with your love to the fields. Lie down in the shade. Rest your head. Plant sequoias. Plant those things that you won't live to see, but that someone will. Plant a forest. Do something that won't compute." And so long-term intention is really not about what you accomplish or what you get, but rather what you plant and how you move, what kind of graciousness you can move through this world, and what it is that you offer to it. And then if you have a beautiful intention, make a beautiful vow or set your intention on those kind of things, then you lose an election, you start over again. Something doesn't work out, Einstein's dissertation was turned down as irrelevant and fanciful by his physics department, right? And Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. And in the first year, Coca-Cola sold 400 bottles, right? So sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. That is not the point. Because you will have praise and blame and gain and loss and pleasure and pain. Anybody not have that? Please raise your hand. You can have your $8 back or whatever it was, right? It's just how it is, right? So then what do we do with it is really the question. What do we make of this in some way? Dina Metzger, poet, writes, "Give me everything mangled and bruised, and I will make a light of it to make you weep, and we will have rain and we will begin again." And it's a poem for Napa and Sonoma and Santa Rosa and for beings all over the world. Give me everything mangled and bruised, and I will make a light of it to make you weep. And we will have rain and we will begin again, because we do and we can. Now, one of the other things that's really important to say is that this capacity to start over or to listen in the compass of the heart that's built in you, you can see it all around you. Life wanting to renew itself. As Pablo Neruda said, you can pick all the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. Life wants to come back, and all you have to do is watch toddlers. I love toddlers. The drunken sailor stage where they're just learning to walk. They try one step and they fall, and then maybe get 2 steps and they fall again on their diaper. They fall like 1,000 times, right? What do? Get back up again, right? And then they start cruising, and it's not like, singles bar cruising. There's a different kind of cruising, but it's just hanging on the edges of things. And basically people are worried, my child is slow to walk or speak or get out of diapers. No kid that I know goes to high school in diapers. It doesn't happen, right? The children want to become independent, and our spirit wants to become free. And I can hear my daughter's voice at 2 years old. However old she says, one of her frequent phrases was, "Me do myself." Me do it, me. That little 2-year-old voice saying, I'm going to do it, but you just put on my shoes, me do it. There's some kind of native and natural opening to freedom that is part of your heart. And the passage I read so often from Thomas Merton to the young activist, where he says, "Do not depend on the hope of results. You may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless and even achieve no result at all, if not perhaps bring about its opposite. As you get used to this, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, and the truth of the work itself." And there's something about dedication that's really setting the compass of the heart in a direction of awakening or love or remembering who you are, of embodying what matters to you in this world. And then there comes this beautiful trust, somehow. Like Pablo Neruda's poem, you can pick all the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. And I don't know, the world is in a lot of difficulty now, as we know, many ways. And yet at the same time, there's also less warfare than there's been in a lot of previous centuries, believe it or not. If you study it, there are a lot more resolutions of conflict that are happening not by war than used to be so. Very slow, we human beings, very, very slow, but we seem to be learning slowly. The moral arc of the universe may be long, but it bends toward justice, as we know. Sometimes it seems very, very long. But then here is Gandhi again, saying, where are you, Gandhi? Come on. I know you're here. Ah, yes. When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been murderers and tyrants, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end they always fall. Think of it, always. And that's really the voice of a kind of truth about life that we can add our own heart to, our own love, our own trust to. So many stories, but I think enough stories for tonight. Close your eyes for a few minutes and just reflect, not as a meditation. You don't have to get into weird posture. You're weird enough as you are without adding to it. But reflect on your own inner commitments or dedication, what matters to you. What have you set your own heart on? And if it's not so apparent, might today be a good day to listen and reflect on what it would be. And what in your life best supports this dedication, this direction? You can know. You are free to choose. This is one of the great gifts of consciousness. You are loving awareness itself, and you can choose. And this is a great gift. So here we are, taken birth, human incarnation, 101, right? You start over and over each time. You kind of wish could move to 102 or something like that, but you forget a lot of what you might have learned if you believe in another incarnation. But anyway, here you are, you're in this strange human body with the tainted glory, to use Oscar Wilde's phrase, of humanity. And we're going into the darkest time of the year, and there are two kinds of darkness. There's the fertile darkness, that is the pregnant void, the darkness out of which all things arise and are born. That's the darkness that contains the potential of creation. And when the physicists talk about outer space and talk about if they can even find some area that doesn't have any physical matter in it, although it's still filled with the, X-rays and gamma rays and all those other things that are passing through it, there's an enormous energy in the vacuum. It's like it just wants to burst forth. So there's the fertile, pregnant darkness that gives birth to all things, the background. They call it dark matter, that kind of thing, 98% or 90 or 88% or whatever it is. They haven't figured that out. Dark energy. It's kind of cool. And then there's the other kind of darkness, which is the darkness of blindness in an unhealthy way, the unseeing, the unconscious darkness. And to awaken, to live in a conscious way, we both have to awaken to what's light and luminous, but we also have to awaken to darkness. And it's not particularly easy. One of the Hindu sages, he writes, "Go ahead, light your candles, candle time, solstice, burn your incense, ring your bells, call out to the gods, but watch out, because the gods will come, and they will put you on their anvil and fire up the forge and beat you until they turn brass into pure gold." So anybody who's ever meditated for a little while understands this in a kind of personal and intimate way. You sit, I'm going to be joyful, peaceful, filled with light. And then Mara and your own personal demons appear as well. Yes, you have beautiful light, but also you have your worries and anxieties, your physical pains, your unfinished business and grief, your loneliness and boredom, your fears and aversions, your aggression, your death. All those things come visit you. So there you are having a nice meditation. Right? And there are stages in the meditation manuals where I train that are called the stages of terror, the stages of facing your death. So it's not like it's a mistake, it's looking at human incarnation. And it's not like somebody else has the problem. You've been born with this human dilemma of joy and sorrow and gain and loss and praise and blame and longing and love and violence as well. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who says, if only it were all so simple, if only it were necessary just to separate. Let's see, how does he start that? 1 second. I'm trying to do it by memory, but he says, if only there were evil people out there insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were just simple, we could separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who among us is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart? So you sit, and if you're honorable in your meditation, you find everything in there, because you are part of the cosmos, and part of humanity, with its joys and its terrors. And then you open your eyes to this world. Plato said, only the dead know the end of war. So there's continuing warfare and racism and injustice and cruelty. There's also waterfalls and flamingos and mangoes and chocolate, I mean, it's wild. And to awaken is to sense this mystery of it all. And here we are, this week in the DRC, the Democratic Republic. I like that they've got both parties in their name. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the worst killing fields probably since World War II. The number of children who are killed, the number of women who are being raped, the number of young people who are being impressed into the army, and it goes on week after week and year after year. And it's just one place on the planet. It's one of the most dire. And we don't really pay attention to it, but there it is, and it's us as humans. And it's a wealthy, fertile, beautiful land. Or this week, and sort of this is the build-up, you wonder why I'm talking about this stuff, is I want to talk about Connecticut and Sandy Hook and the gunning down of innocence, which is almost unbelievable. It takes your breath away. Unbearable, senseless carnage. And it's there, so we see it and feel it. We don't see it when it happens in a village in the Congo, or when it happens to girls in rural, Afghanistan, or someplace. But here it was. It's made visible to us in some terrible, terrible way, almost unbearable. And so we have a task if we are to live honorably, if we are to live an awake life. The first task, perhaps two, is to not let the outer ignorant darkness, that kind of darkness, take over your heart. To not let that come in and poison you. But the second task, which is equally important, is to not avert your gaze. To not let yourself turn away because you can't bear it. So Ram Dass was teaching a class, dear friend Ram Dass, author of Be Here Now in the 60s and so forth, in Oakland a couple of decades ago on service as a path to awakening the heart. And after some weeks of the class, talking about how you paid attention to the people around you and how you offered things and what was going on in you as you served the world. A woman raised her hand and said, I've been really learning something in this class. He said, would you tell your story? So she said, every day, on my way to work for the last year, there's a homeless guy who sits near the BART station, and I put money in his cup. He's just become one of my people. And I, just as I pay my money to get on BART, I offer him something every morning. And it feels very good to do it. But after our classes, I realized that I'd never really looked at him. I've never really looked him in the eye. And so I started to pay attention as I did it, and I went to give him the money, and I realized I was afraid to look him in the eye. And then I understood why I was afraid to look him in the eye. Because she said if I really looked at him, I was afraid that he would be moved to my living room couch for the rest of the year if I really looked him in the eye. And I didn't know what to do with that. You understand? So it's neither to let the violence and the ignorance of that kind of darkness take over your heart so you drown in it, nor is it to avert your gaze. Now, the Buddha teaches that we should look not just at the results, but at causes and conditions. And in Connecticut, what happened is the result of a lot of causes and conditions. How do we deal with mental illness in this culture? And I know, we use medication, but it's too quick sometimes. Don't even talk to people. And I also know somebody in my extended family who was put on medication, a relatively young person who committed suicide shortly after because they weren't being tracked for their antidepressant. And it has that other effect. There's all this weird stuff. And now we don't talk to people. We just medicate them in some way or other. And our prisons are actually our default mental hospitals. Mental hospitals are closed. Imagine being, having mental illness and then being stuck in a prison. What kind of civilization? Or you can talk about somebody shooting people as a kind of twisted attempt to get attention. The old adage, it's better to be wanted by the police than not wanted at all, right? Or the weird drugs like bath salts and things that are around. But also there's the celebration of the pornography of violence in this culture. The video games. Just go to watch the new James Bond movie, right? And watch all the trailers because it's the action movie trailers you get, and it's like half an hour of people shooting one another up and blowing things up, and killing one another. What fun! And not only that, we export it. So I remember starting to travel around, in different countries 20, 30, 40 years ago. American movies, Rambo was the big thing in Mongolia or Indonesia or Africa or things like that. That's real America. Come on. We do this. And then on top of the celebration of violence is our hyper-individualistic cowboy frontier man archetype, right? That you're going to do it all yourself. But forget that the cowboy, that his gun was actually made by somebody else somewhere. And so was his axe and his pump handle and, the candle or kerosene lamp. The idea that you're not connected with other people is crazy. And yet we live this kind of archetype. We'll be self-sufficient, and the others, the communists or the UN's black helicopters or the Muslims or the immigrants, somebody's not going to get us. We'll protect ourselves somehow. And we're a warlike nation. If you look at our history, the last century plus, we've almost not been at peace. We've been at one war after another. Now we're doing two at once. We're multitasking. And we're the largest weapons exporter on the face of the earth. We're headed into the solstice, by the way. You want to talk about darkness, we're going through it for a moment. Because it's in your heart. You have Connecticut there. And it's not just those children, but it's the causes and conditions that we as a society have to at least not turn away from. We have the largest military budget, more than the next 10 military budgets of all other countries in the world. We supply $100 billion of killing machines every year to other parts of the world, and then we get afraid that we're not so safe. Funny. And it's crazy. As Jon Stewart said, one failed attempt at a shoe bomb and we all have to take our shoes off. 31 school shootings since Columbine and no change in our gun laws. So that's the reptilian brain, in case you hadn't noticed. There's the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain, and then there's some higher functioning. But we can trigger the fear in each other, the survival fear, very easily. And we get, fearful and fundamentalist in all these kinds of ways very, very easily. So what are we to do? Mourn, yes, weep. But also stand up for a different world. Not just mourn and weep. So the violence and the misunderstanding has to be met with some equal force. And it's really the force of love and a kind of courage that's a different part of who we are, but an equally important and valuable and genuine human part. Now, one of the good things I can say tonight, I was reading Steven Pinker's book. Some of you may know it, The Better Angels of Our Nature. He's anthropologist, historian, philosopher. It's brilliant. And, Bill Gates says, maybe the most important book I've ever read. Wall Street Journal calls it masterly, but so also does MSNBC, Fox. I mean, it's like all across the spectrum. And what his thesis is, that the world is actually getting better. That if you look over the last 4 or 5 centuries, that the kind of global changes are, there's less violence, there is a gradual abolishment of capital punishment in many parts of the world, a gradual abolishment of slavery, a gradual abolishment of despotism. There is an understanding that even though it still happens, genocide is wrong. There is an increase in civil rights, an increase in women's rights and the way women are treated, and gay rights and the rights of children. There isn't so much child labor anymore, although there is some. There is, he goes on and on. By various different measures and markers, even though we're pretty damn uncivilized, we're getting better. That's a really important thing to say at this time. Now, just so it doesn't go to your head, at the University of Chicago, Imdal Ben Ami Bartal and Jean Desity did a study of rats, and they were giving them chocolate chips. These were really happy rats. But they had a captive rat in a cage next to a free rat, and they could hear the distress calls of the captive rat. And the free rat learned with greater time how to open the cage for the captive rat, even if it wasn't getting any reward. And not only that, it saved a chocolate chip or two for that rat. It did. Okay, so it doesn't go to your head, right? So built into Darwin, and if you read Darwin, Darwin did a whole book on compassion and interdependence. He didn't just talk about the survival of this, the fittest, but he did a whole thing about interdependence that we don't read about. We only read Cowboy Darwin, but there's a whole other part of Darwin that's really worthy of looking at. It's not just the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of those who collaborate. It's the web of interdependence. It's life as a field that we are a part of. Now, the thing that's true is that this wisdom that's not the reptilian brain, or maybe even the mammalian brain, although the rats seem to have a pretty, they got both sides like we do. Not only is it natural to us in some way, but also it can be reminded, awakened, trained, supported. The capacity that we have not just to act from the impulses of fear and violence and prejudice and racism and those things. Those are one part of our consciousness and brain. We actually don't have to follow them. And the Buddha said, he said, if it were not possible to train you to do this, I wouldn't teach. But just because it is possible for us, so I offer these practices. How to incline the mind. Others will be cruel, we shall not be cruel, thus we will incline the mind. Others will kill living beings, we will not kill living beings, thus we will incline the mind. Others will take what doesn't belong to them, we will abstain from taking what belongs to them, thus we will incline the mind. Others will speak maliciously and untruthfully. We will speak kindly and truthfully, thus we will incline the mind. Others will be envious. We will not be envious, thus we'll incline the mind. Others will be arrogant. We will not. Thus we'll incline the mind. Others will be harsh without compassion. We shall establish compassion, thus we should incline the mind. Others will lack wisdom. We shall cultivate wisdom, thus we shall incline the mind. And it's a reminder for us as a humanity that this is also our birthright. This is also possible. Now, in the ancient stories, in the forests of India of that time, when the Buddha, as the story is told, gave instructions to monks and nuns of how to quiet their mind and develop a sense of mindful awareness and an inner sense of freedom, he sent them off into the forests and jungles to meditate. And in this particular occasion, a group of them came running back because the forest that they were sent into was filled with wild animals and strange sounds of ghosts and spirits. And they said, we're terrified. We can't practice there. Help us. And he said, I'll give you a protection that will work in the forests of the wild animals, which are mostly the wild animals in your own mind, by the way, just to get this clear. And the spirits. And that was the first occasion in these teachings anyway, when he offered the systematic instruction on loving kindness meditation. He said, if you can learn to dwell in your heart, offering love to all beings, that will be a protection no matter where you go. People will sense it and love you more. Your health will be better. Your mind will be quieter. You'll fall asleep easily. You'll waken contented. Your children will be happier. Elephants will bow as you go by. There's a whole long list of all this. It's called unconditional friendliness. And it's really a beautiful teaching and practice. And you kind of, as most of you know who've done the loving kindness meditation, You start very simply by awakening the sense, the wishing, well-wishing for yourself and others. And then you extend it to all living beings, weak or strong, young or old, born or yet to be born, long or short, no legs, 2 legs, many legs, 4 legs, however, whatever form, far and near. And you begin to extend the friendliness of your heart. Now the thing is that love, which is so mysterious, it's like gravity. I think it's because we were all together in the singularity, the physicists call it. That's where you used to live 13.6 billion years ago today, as Wes would say, right? And then you exploded into, stars, galaxies, planets. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was a ball of molten stone, and now it can sing opera, as Brian Swim likes to say. That love is like gravity, cosmic allurement. It's that sense that we actually all belong to one another. And when we feel it, when we open ourselves to it, we know that this is true. And we've all fallen in love, and we've all had our days of love. And we all have known what it's like to gaze with the eyes of love upon another or a creation. Or as the Buddha said, to hold another being the way a mother holds her most beloved child. But when love, which is called one of the 4 states of the awakened heart, this is the developed heart and mind that we have a capacity for, when love is awakened, it also changes flavor. When love meets pain and suffering, it turns into compassion. Because you can't wish, oh, sweet, happy love when someone's child has just died. You can't love sweet, happy love when somebody is in great fear and pain and suffering. And so instead, that touch of love in the place of sorrow transforms it into the heart of compassion. And it's not only the children in Connecticut whose names are listed here, 6 years old, 7 years old, 6 years old, Grace and Jessie and Catherine and Madeline and Dylan and Lauren and Noah and Benjamin. It's not only those children, but it's all the children who are really all our children. And especially it's all the children who are hungry, who are unprotected, or are sick, or whose parents can't take care of them, whose parents can't protect them, which there are. And so when the door of compassion opens, it's not just for one being, but it starts to sense and feel the compassion for life. But love also can meet beauty and turn into joy, mudita, the joy of being part of this amazing creation. Alice Walker, she writes, I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. People think pleasing God is all God care about, but any fool living in the world can see it's always trying to please us back. And so it's also important, just as there's tragedy, that there is also beauty. And that you don't want to deny joy or happiness. To deny your happiness is to lessen the importance of the deprivation of others. And it doesn't help for you not to feel the happiness that's given to you and then to use it to offer it. It's like Wes Nisker, colleague, friend, who went to talk to Gary Snyder, interview him a few months ago. Gary's 84 and this extraordinary poet, environmentalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, who's been doing the environmental consciousness raising for half a century, one of our great teachers in that way. And he said, Gary, he started the interview, with global warming and environmental destruction and loss of species and so forth, what do you say as one of our elders? What do you say to people? How do you advise us? And he looked and he said, first thing he said is, don't feel guilty. He said, that doesn't help. He said, if you're going to save it, it's not going to be saved out of your guilt. Love it. Walk in it, breathe it, touch it, see its flowers, love a tree, find a place that matters to you. Find the joy in life and let that love be what inspires you to save what you can. And the same for meditation. It's not meant to be a grim duty, although it has its tough parts, because you sit with yourself. I like nothing more in the world than just listening, sitting on my ass, being happy, doing nothing. And it's not my fault that I have this attitude, writes Laurie Chapman, because I happen to have an amazingly comfortable ass. It may not look like much, but if you could sit on this baby for 2 minutes, you'd realize that getting off this ass would be a crime against nature. So there's love, and there's compassion, oceans of it, because there's so much sorrow, but there's also almost unbearable beauty, and it keeps being reborn, and you can't deny that either. And then there's the deep peace that comes to the heart when we rest and see the magnificence of this dance we're born into. And when we come still, our stillness becomes like a mirror for those around us to see. As Yeats says, we can make our minds so like still water that beings gather around us, that they may live to see their own, that they may see their own images, and so live for a moment with a clearer, perhaps even a fiercer life because of our quiet. That too is a gift of the awakened heart. Just to be still and see the magnificence of it as it is. So these are the dimensions of the awakened heart. And the gift is that with training, it's possible to do this. So my friend and colleague and teacher Mahagosananda, who was the Gandhi of Cambodia, we lived in this forest monastery doing loving kindness meditation over and over and over again. And then he built these temples in the refugee camps and did 15 years of walking people on foot through the killing fields back to their villages, chanting loving kindness over and over, saying you can't return home without every step offering a prayer of love to reclaim the land that you've lived on from this war. Only then will you feel that you're home. And it's because he trained to do it, he actually could carry it. It was an amazing thing to see. Dina Metzger, the poet, activist friend, she says, give me everything mangled and bruised, and I will make a light of it to make you weep, and we will have rain, and we will begin again. And we do. We start over and over and over again, and it is possible to do this for you. And we all hold in some way this imagination, whether it's Nelson Mandela walking out of prison 27 years in Robben Island with so much magnanimity and graciousness, or Aung San Suu Kyi, or whoever it is that you carry, we all know it. We know it's a human possibility. So Dante, you remember him, the author of the Divine Comedy, was standing near the Ponte Vecchio, the bridge that crosses the Arno River in Florence. It was about 1285 or 1290, just before 1300. And Dante saw Beatrice standing on the bridge. He was a young man, she even younger, and that vision contained the whole of eternity for him. Dante didn't speak to her and saw her very little, and then Beatrice died, carried off by the plague. Dante was stricken with the loss of his vision, for she was the connection between his soul and heaven itself. You know what it's like to fall in love. 650 years later, during World War II, The Americans were chasing the German army up the Italian peninsula. The Germans were blowing up everything of aid to the progression of the American army, including the bridges across all the rivers. But no one wanted to blow up the Ponte Vecchio because Beatrice had stood on it and Dante had written about her. So the German commandant made radio contact with the Americans and in plain language said they would leave the Ponte Vecchio intact if the Americans would promise not to use it. And the promise held. The bridge was not blown up and not one American soldier or piece of equipment went across it. We're such hard-bitten people that we need hard-bitten proof of things, and this is the most hard-bitten fact of love that I know to present to you. The bridge was spared in a modern, ruthless war because Beatrice had stood upon it. So we also carry this in us, each one of us, in this amazing way. "O nobly born," says the Buddha, "do not forget who you really are." And the Dharma, which is the word that means truth, teachings, all these kind of things, is really the Dharma of the heart. And the point isn't to perfect yourself. You've tried that, didn't work, right? Therapy, gym, whatever. The point is to perfect your love. And it's all kinds. It's individual and global and, this is Pablo Neruda, one of his love sonnets. "When I die, I want your hands on my eyes. I want the light and wheat of your beloved hands to pass their freshness over me once more. I want to feel the softness that changed my destiny." What a boyfriend, huh? William Blake said, "If one is to do good, it must be done in the minute particulars. General good is a plea of the flatterer, the scoundrel, and the hypocrite." So in the end, there aren't really very many questions when you come to the end of life. You know what matters? Did I love well? Was I forgiving, gracious, open-hearted? If you didn't love well, what was it for? Maybe did I live fully too? Did I give myself to life? There's a beautiful poem called "In the Evening You Will Be Examined on Love." It's the first line of it. The great blue book in the sky. So a story to read you that some of you know. It was Thursday, Christmas. Our family had spent the days before the holiday in San Francisco with my husband's parents. But in order for us to be back at work in Los Angeles, we found ourselves driving the 400 miles to Southern California on Christmas Day. It was normally an 8-hour drive, but with kids it can be a 14-hour endurance test. When we could stand it no longer, we stopped for lunch in King City, a little metropolis made up of 6 gas stations and a diner. And it was into that one diner that the 4 of us trooped, road-weary and saddle-sore. As I sat Eric, our 1-year-old, in a high chair, I looked around the room. The restaurant was nearly empty. We were the only family, and ours were the only children. Everyone else was busy eating, talking quietly, aware perhaps that we were all somehow out of place on this special day. My reverie was interrupted when I heard Eric squeal with glee, "Hi there!" 2 words he thought were one. "Hi there!" He pounded his fat baby hands whack, whack on the metal high chair tray. His face alive with excitement, eyes wide, gums bared, and a toothless baby grin. He wriggled and chirped, and then I saw the source of his merriment, and my eyes couldn't take it all in at once. A tattered rag of a coat, dirty, greasy, and worn, baggy pants, a spindly body, toes that poked out of old, old shoes, and a face like none other, gums as bare as Eric's, hair uncombed, unwashed, whiskers too short to be called a beard. I was too far away to smell him, but I knew he smelled, and his hands were waving in the air, flapping about on loose wrists. "Hi there, baby. Hi, big boy. I see you, Buster." My husband and I exchanged a look that was a cross between, what do we do, and oh, poor devil. Eric continued to laugh and answer, hi there. Every call was echoed. I noticed waitresses' eyebrows shoot to their foreheads, and several people sitting near us ahemed out loud. This old geezer was creating a nuisance with my beautiful baby. I shoved a cracker at Eric, and he pulverized it on the tray. I thought, why me, under my breath. The meal came, and the nuisance continued. Now the old bum was shouting from across the room, do you know patty cake? Attaboy, you know peekaboo, look, he knows peekaboo. Nobody thought it was cute. The guy was probably drunk and a definite disturbance. I was embarrassed. My husband was humiliated. Even our 6-year-old said, why is that old man talking so loud? We ate in silence, except Eric, who was running through his repertoire for the admiring applause of his Skid Row bum. Finally, I had enough. I turned the high chair. Eric screamed and clamored around to face his old buddy. Now I was really mad. Dennis went to pay the check, imploring me to get Eric and meet me in the parking lot. I trundled Eric out of the high chair and looked toward the exit. The old man sat poised, waiting, his chair directly between me and the door. Lord, just let me out of here before he speaks to me or Eric, and I headed to the door. It soon became apparent that both the Lord and Eric had other plans. As I drew closer to the man, I turned my back, walking to sidestep him. And as I did so, Eric, all the while his eyes riveted on his new best friend, leaned far over my arm, reaching with both arms in the baby's pick-me-up position. In a split second of balancing my baby and turning to counter his weight, I came eye to eye with the old man. Eric was lunging for him, arms spread wide. The old bum's eyes asked, implored, would you let me hold your baby? There was no need for me to answer, since Eric propelled himself from my arms into the man's. Suddenly, a very old man and a very young baby were involved in a love relationship. Eric laid his tiny head upon the man's ragged shoulder, and the man's eyes closed, and I saw tears hover beneath the lashes. His aged hands, full of grime and pain and hard labor, gently, so gently, cradled my baby's bottom and stroked his back. The old man rocked and cradled Eric in his arms for a moment, and then his eyes opened and he set squarely on mine, said in a firm, commanding voice, now you take proper care of this baby. And somehow I managed, I will, from a throat that contained a stone. He pried Eric from his chest, unwillingly, longingly, as though he was in pain. I held my arms open to receive my baby, and again the gentleman addressed me. God bless you, ma'am. You've given me my Christmas gift. I said nothing more than a muttered thanks, and with Eric back in my arms, I ran for the car. Dennis wondered why I was crying and holding Eric so tightly, and why I was saying, my God, don't let me forget. Please don't let me forget. So what matters? When the rains come, or the tears, or tragedy, that kind of darkness, or the darkness of this season, it becomes the time to quiet your mind and listen to your heart, not avert your gaze, but to set your intention most deeply. What are you doing with this human life? To turn the compass of your heart to what really matters. That's what's called for. The Bodhisattva vows are one way that people do it, to take a vow in yourself. This is what I want to do with my life. Diane Ackerman, a modern Bodhisattva vows that I love. In the name of daybreak and the eyelids of morning, and the wayfaring moon and the night when it departs, I swear I will not dishonor my soul with hatred, but offer myself humbly as a guardian of nature, a healer of misery, a messenger of wonder, an architect of peace. Or the Dalai Lama, who wakes up every morning 4 in the morning, 3:30. It says the same vows in a different form from Shantideva. May I be medicine for all who are sick. May I be a boat or a raft or a bridge for all to cross over the stream. May I be food for the hungry, a lamp for those who've lost their way in the darkness. May I be a resting place for the weary. May I bring inspiration and care in illumination as long as the world, earth and sky exist, and longer, until I and all beings awaken together. Some little vow like that, or those kind of things. But it actually works. Henry David Thoreau, though I do not believe that a plant will spring up where no seed has been, I have great faith in a seed. Convince me you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders. And there are the outer seeds that we plant. But this really speaks of the seeds in the heart. What do you plant? And what do you plant in the dark time of the year when everyone lights candles and waits for the earth to make its turning and the sun to again begin to re-illuminate the world? But it's the seeds of loving kindness. Ursula Le Guin, love doesn't just sit there like a stone. It has to be made like bread, remade all the time, made new every morning for breakfast. And so you read the loving kindness practice, and its instruction is omitting none. Sitting and opening the heart with loving kindness toward oneself, one's loved ones, one's benefactor, one's community, one's family, one's friends, the beings and creatures around, thick and thin, tall and short, young and old, north, south, east and west, with the sublime abiding of love directing this in every direction. And then adding compassion for the parents, the families, for all those who've lost someone, who are frightened. I suppose this is really the lighting of the inner candle. Angelus Silesius, the Christian mystic, says, if in your heart you make a manger for his birth, then Christ will once again become born on this earth. So that's really where the manger lives. When Gina spoke last night about the nature of clinging to self, to me and mine, the sense of selfishness that we can experience, and the possibility of not clinging, it spoke from the very center of the teachings of the Buddha, really of the Four Noble Truths of suffering in the world and the conditions that create suffering and the possibility of freeing ourselves, which here we are now on the 6th or 7th day of our practice together, is in a certain way the underlying practice that we share. We come together here and we all experience what the Buddha saw and what motivated his practice. We look at the world, we look at ourselves, and if we look with the eyes of compassion, we can see how much confusion and sorrow can be created by us within our own experience or in the world around us. And as you've been sitting and walking, my guess is there have been moments when you got caught up in, if not lost in, certain stories, and by being identified and lost in them for a time, also you felt the suffering of it. A couple from snowy Minnesota decided to take a winter vacation back in the simple Florida resort where they had stayed for a honeymoon 25 years before. Because of his wife's delayed work schedule, the husband went first, and then when he got there, he received a message that she would meet him soon. So he sent her this email in reply, but because he typed one letter wrong in the email address, it went by mistake to an old woman in Oklahoma whose minister husband had just died the day before. Here's what she read. Dearest, well, the journey is over and I've finally arrived. I was surprised to find they have email here now. They tell me you will be coming soon. It will be good to be together again. Love as always. P.S. Be prepared, it's quite hot down here. And we can see, actually, how easily we get caught up in stories. They might not even be our own stories. We learned them, or they came in from the culture, and then we get lost in the mind creations. But it's not just us. As we know, too, we sit here in a certain way, in silence, and yet our breath with the trees and our movement and the water in our bodies and everything that is true of us, our mind and consciousness, connects with all the rest of humanity, the rest of the world. John Gatto, New York City Teacher of the Year, when he received his award, he castigated the school board and the mayor for the soul murder of 1 million black and Latino children in the school system. And then he said, think of the things that are killing us as a nation. Drugs, brainless competition, recreational sex, the pornography of violence and racism, gambling, alcohol, and the worst pornography of all, lives devoted to buying things, accumulation as a religion. What does this do to our children, he asked. And so the Buddha looked out and he saw the same kinds of forces at his time, of greed and aggression and delusion and denial, and saw, as we can, how they are rooted in clinging to a small sense of self, to a limited identity, to our body, our way of being, us versus someone else. It's called the body of fear, in some ways, this small or contracted sense of self. And we've all experienced it at moments as we've been sitting and walking, each in our own way. And yet, while we experience this, the clinging, the fear, the depression, the confusion that comes, something in us also can sense the possibility of greater compassion and greater freedom. We know, as the Buddha did, that this is not the only way. And what we discover as we practice together, what the Buddha discovered, that this is not our true identity. And in a certain way, meditation, more than anything else, is an invitation to a radical shift of identity from this small sense of self to our Buddha nature, to our true nature, to what Ajahn Chah used to call jitta-dharma, which means original mind. And one of the descriptions in the Buddhist tradition of this original nature that we return to, or Buddha nature, is the 10 paramitas, or the 10 perfections of the heart. And sometimes they're taught in a kind of linear way, the perfections of patience and generosity and renunciation and truthfulness and so forth, which I'll talk about some tonight. Kind of developmentally, they're spoken about almost in a mythological way, all the previous birth stories of the Buddha. And somebody said, oh, Venerable Blessed One, how long does it take to become a Buddha? And he said, 100,000 mahakalpas and 4 immensities of practicing patience and compassion and truthfulness and integrity and so forth. Well, how long is a mahakalpa? He said, imagine a mountain that is 7 yojanas high, 7 yojanas wide, and 7 yojanas long. A yojana is the distance an ox cart can go in a day, so about 7 miles, okay? So here's a mountain
taller than Mount Everest, as wide and as deep. And every 100 years, a bird comes with a silk scarf in its beak and drags the silk across the top of that mountain, wearing it away slightly every 100 years. When that mountain is worn down by the bird, that's one Mahakalpa. You hear this and you go, oh my God, 9 days was tough. But 100,000 Mahakalpas. And if we take it as a model in that way, I've got to practice patience, I've got to practice compassion, I've got to, and so forth, it's impossible. Because it's not meant to be taken in that way. It's actually speaking archetypally, it's speaking a language of the spirit or the soul or the imagination that's not within time. If you take it in time, it makes no sense. And what it says is that this is not about the small sense of self. You can't make your personality into this. This speaks about something that is eternal, that is timeless, that is so much bigger than the small stories that we get lost in. And the invitation of our practice is to step into this greater vision that is our true nature. The point is not the future of humanity, said one sage, but the presence of eternity. Not our ideas about how we're going to fix things and so forth. Yes, we have to tend to that. But underneath, if the tending doesn't come from a vision of that which is timeless and wise and genuinely connected, it will just be spinning our wheels. So what does this have to do with our sitting here? It's really a beautiful thing for me to see people come into interviews over the course of the week, because you all go through your ups and downs. It never gets better and better and better. It gets better and worse and sort of oscillates. It does get better, but with lots of waves, as you experience that. One sitting is glorious, and another sitting, oh my God, how many more sittings do I have to tolerate? And then another sitting, oh, this is great, I'm going to sign up for a longer retreat. And then a few sittings later, what was I thinking, right? But what we start to see is in that there's a kind of settling and releasing and opening that's beautiful to observe, and a movement from the small sense of self as our identity to that which is greater. I went to a dinner in the Bay Area some time ago and to do some teaching. The dinner sort of came at the end of it for the hospices of the San Francisco area, because I've done a lot of work with death and dying, sitting with people in various circumstances since the days of the monastery, and sitting with corpses in the charnel grounds and so forth. And after I did the teaching, one of the people who sat with me at the dinner table was a Palestinian man who's become a very good friend of mine named Salam Khalili. And so I said to him, we were talking, I said, what brings you to do hospice work? And he said, my experience in prison. I said, what's that? Because I've done a lot of work in different prisons and quite interested. He said, I was a journalist in Jerusalem in the late 60s, before and after the 67 war. And I was writing about a free Palestinian state and Palestinians having part of Jerusalem as a capital. And at that time, it was forbidden to do so in Israel. And so periodically I'd be carted off to jail or prison. I spent about 6 years on and off in prison. I'd write and they'd arrest me. And while I was in prison, once in a while I would get beaten or tortured in some way, which happens in war. It happens on both sides. It's not like one-sided. It's just what happens. People go insane in war. He said, so one day I was in this prison, and this guard was beating me and kicking me, and I died. He said, there I was on the floor, and this boot was kicking me, and blood was coming out of my mouth, and the police report says that I died. But actually what happened is all this pain, and then all of a sudden it stopped, and I was floating on the ceiling watching it. People hear these stories because they happen in accidents. They also happen in meditation. There are ways of actually leaving your body, and it's not that difficult to do. But this happened to him. And he said, I watched it, and I felt so peaceful because it wasn't really my body then. That was just what was happening. And then something interesting happened. He said, what happened is that the bubble of the sense of my consciousness observing myself popped, broke, and all of a sudden I became everything. He said, I was the walls of the prison and the old green paint flecking off the walls. I was the body there, but I was also the boot kicking it, and the dirt under the fingernails of the guard. And I was the goat whose bleating you could hear from the window outside. And I was all of it. And I knew that I was never born and never could die. And he said, then I looked at this and I said, what is all the fuss about? He said, I felt so peaceful and so joyful because I knew who I really was. He said, and then a few days later I woke up in this broken body at the bottom of a cell. He said, but I was smiling, and it took a while for my body to heal. And I got out of prison and I couldn't do anything for the Palestinians anymore. It didn't make any sense. He said, I married a Jewish woman, I have Jewish Palestinian children, and that's my answer. So he said, I sit with people who are dying because I want to let them know that it's nothing to be afraid of, basically. And there is a certain way that as we come and practice together here, and you sit through your pain and fear and loneliness and depression and longing and ideas and all the different things that will come and go, there's a steadying of your being. In the midst of the tension in the body, there's an opening of the mindfulness of resting in awareness itself as the mind tells its stories in the unfinished business of emotional waves come and go, that allows us to return to what we already know, to who we already are. Hafiz, again the Iraqi poet, he says, the mind is ever a tourist, wanting to touch and buy new things, then toss them into an already filled closet. And you sit here and the mind does all that stuff, and something greater than that, the knowing, the awareness itself, becomes able to contain and be the witnessing of it, and beyond that, as Salam experienced. Now, it's difficult for some of you, I know, some of us, because we're tremendously loyal to our suffering. We've suffered, we're the victims of our suffering, we're the wounded people in some ways, and, I'm one of them. And I've gone through all my stuff and my years of therapy and various things like that. Remember that passage I read from Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst again, where he says that people resist the noble aspects of their shadow more strenuously than they hide their dark sides. It's more disrupting to find you have a profound nobility of character than to find out that you're a bum. And there's a certain way in which meditation really asks of us a willingness to, yes, bow to accept the measure of sorrows, the struggles that we have. And yet, as we honor them, there's also a kind of letting go of the armoring, an undressing, if you will, of these layers, so that something beautiful can shine through them. Victor Hugo, who wrote, I met a man on the street, a very poor man who was in love. His hat was old, his coat was out at the elbows, the water passed through his shoes, and the stars shone through his soul. And there's moments here, there's gaps, we're lost in things, and then there opens a moment, we realize, wow, I was really caught in that. In the dining room, or taking our walk, or changing clothes, or coming into a sitting, and then all of a sudden the space opens up and say, wow, I was really in that, but that's not what's here now. This space of knowing, of the one who knows, begins to open up. And with it comes this beautiful and inherent wisdom. As Alice Walker wrote, she said, one day I was sitting quiet, feeling like a motherless child, which I was, and it came to me, that feeling of being part of everything, not separate at all. And I knew if I cut a tree, my arm would bleed. And I laughed and I cried and I run all around the house. I just knew what it was. In fact, when it happens, you can't miss it. And this kind of knowing, which we carry from before we were born, begins to awaken in the stillness and the steadiness of our practice. It's as if we've been daydreaming or asleep, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, this is what it's about. I mean, we see it when we're with someone who's dying. We see it when something important happens in our life. And the 10 perfections, then, are not a description of perfecting ourselves in some way, but rather they're reminders of this inherent true nature that is who we are underneath the body of fear, all this other stuff. And I'll talk about some of them, partly because they're a pleasure to talk about, and because they may resonate in you as you remember your practice over these days, or even more deeply, as you remember what Thomas Merton called the secret beauty that we don't let ourselves see in each other if we really looked and saw it. He said our problem would be we would fall down and worship each other. How would we deal with that? And the first of these is Sila Is Virtue. Anna talked about it. But it's really Adi Sila. These are all the inherent virtue. Adi means the higher or the natural virtue. And Ajahn Chah used to love to talk about integrity and virtue. It was one of his favorite subjects. Integrity within yourself, integrity within others. And the integrity is basically to say what's true, to be with what's so, and to not cause harm to another being. To not add to the pain of your own body, of your own heart. To not add to the pain of another being. So, Lloyd Reynolds, who was the great American calligrapher of this past century, wrote this beautiful poem in this wonderful hand. He was one of my wife's teachers, master. He writes, "A bug crawls over the paper. Leave him be. We need all the readers we can get." And there's some way in the monastery in which there's a kind of care where you don't step on the ants and the bugs. And there's a beauty to that integrity, that our virtue is let us not harm another being. And there was a time when a person's word was gold, and when a person was really measured by their actions. Here's a story, an old story from the Christian Desert Fathers. Abbot Anastasius had a Bible written on very fine parchment worth 18 pieces of gold. And once a young brother came to visit him, and seeing the book, magnificent book, made off with it. So that day when the abbot went to read the book, found it was gone, he realized it was taken. But he didn't send after him to inquire about it, for fear that the young brother might add perjury to the theft. Didn't want him to have to lie about it and make it worse. Well, the brother went down to Alexandria to sell it, and the price he asked was 16 gold coins. And the buyer said, "Leave it with me and I find out whether it's worth that much." And he took it up to the monastery to the abbot and said, "Father, look at this, please tell me whether it's worth 16 gold coins." And the abbot looked and said, "Yes, it's a very fine book, it's worth at least that much." So the buyer went back to the young brother and said, "Here is your money." I showed the book to Abbot Anastasius, and he said, "It's a truly fine book worth at least that much." And the brother asked, "Was that all he said? Did he make no other remarks?" "No," said the buyer, "not a word." "Well," said the brother, "give it to me. I've changed my mind. I don't want to sell it." And he hastened back and begged the abbot with tears to take it. But the abbot would not accept it and said, "Go in peace, young brother. I make a present of it." But the brother said, "If you do not take it back, I shall never find peace in my life." And after that, he dwelled with Abbot Anastasius, and they lived happily ever after, or whatever happens in these stories. But what's beautiful about the story, for me, is not just his kindness, but the kind of resonance of integrity, that here something happened, and he will not pay it back in that limited coin of fear and greed. He will only pay it back from the integrity of the heart. It's like Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, now almost 15 years under house arrest. Her husband dying of cancer in England, her children graduating from college, and the military saying, you can go back, we'll let you out. The only thing is that if you leave Burma, we may not allow you to come back. And she's this little, frail little woman. Steel. Just unshakable. She will not move. And it's not, from my friends and people who know her, not out of hatred and not out of ambition. She simply knows this is what's given for her to do and this is what's right. And she lives from that place. And we hear these stories in a certain way, they're kind of grand stories. Not in a certain way, they are. But at the same time, we each, every day as we sit and walk and go through our circumstances, there's suffering, difficulties that we face, and there's the opportunity. How will we treat the bug crawling over the paper? How will we treat the person that we live with? How will we treat ourselves? And from our Buddha nature, there is this kind of integrity. And with it, there also comes a tremendous generosity, one of the other of the paramitas. And generosity isn't because you're supposed to be generous. I mean, it's certainly one of the traditional trainings. It's not out of impoverishment or something, but it's really out of inner abundance. As the poet Rumi says, walking out of the Treasury building, I feel generous. Anybody still sober in this spring weather must be really afraid. And it's finding that our happiness comes not by clinging, but by giving it away. It's just our true nature. This from a novel by Mary Gaitskill. And in it she writes of a character, Veronica, who's a social work intern in one of the worst neighborhoods in Watts. Veronica had seen a stray cat known in the neighbor as Baldy and gotten the idea to feed it. She worried, though, what the people she worked with around the community center would think. At first I thought they were angry with me, the men. They glared and they said, he don't know what to do with anything like that. He ain't never had anything that good in his life. And I said, well, I'll just try. And I opened the can. And they stopped playing pool and cards, and they all watched when I put it down. And I can tell you, the way that cat buried his head in that can, he'd thrust his head down, fingers splayed, his voice rolling, softly gobbling. He looked up at us, and if cats could cry, tears would have been streaming down his face. Nobody said a word. And then one of the men crouched down and held the can so the cat could get to it better. And every day after that, I brought in a can of food, and every day the men would stop and gather to watch Baldy eat. It was probably one of the few times that they got to see a righteous need completely satisfied. And the thing that's true about generosity is that it wants to come out of us when we can. It really does. And as it does, it expresses not, oh, I'm giving to you, but here we are. What else could we do? Consider the generosity of the 1-year-old, writes Alison Luderman, one of my favorite poets, who has no words to exchange with you yet, and instead offers up her favorite drooled-on blanket, her green dinosaur as big as she is, her cloth doll with the long pigtails, her battered cardboard book swung open on their soggy pages. If you were outdoors, she would hand you a dead beetle, a fistful of grass, a pebble, by way of introduction, or just because. And if a moment later she wanted it back, it would be for the joy of the game that makes every simple object an offering. In the same way, sun drapes a buttered scarf across your face. Rose opens herself to your glance, and rain shares its divine melancholy. The whole world keeps whispering or shouting to you, nibbling your ear like a neglected lover. And the generosity on the retreat, you can feel it, is care for one another, but it's also feeding yourself. You sit and you take a cup of tea when you're mindful, and there's a sense of really taking in a cup of tea or a bowl of soup, feeding yourself or offering yourself forgiveness or kindness or whatever it is that you're struggling with as you're sitting and walking. There comes this possibility of a deep generosity toward one another, toward the world in which we live, and especially toward this one sitting here. The perfections, our own nature, integrity, generosity. One of the next of the perfections is the perfection of patience. I saw a cartoon by Matt Groening. You know those little kind of creatures that are in Life in Hell? Many of you know him, the guy who created The Simpsons. And one of them sitting there like you in meditation, this kind of little, faux meditation mudra, smiling and saying, I am living in the eternal present. And the next scene says, next things, I only find myself in the now. In the now, everything is complete. All is here and now. No need to long for anything. Timeless, perfect, you get, one thing after another. The great space of presence. And then there's a little ding in the second to the last box, just a sound. And then you see him, dang, that microwave popcorn takes a long time. And we're like him, We're sitting here being the Buddha, the breathing in and out, I have this great experience. And then you go and you get in line for lunch. The line is so long. If only people would move ahead and go over to that other table and, then I could get to my food sooner. Or, if only the bell would ring. Or if only whatever when you're in traffic, that small sense of self. But something else starts to open up for us here. Poem from a friend. She wrote, I once walked the 6 miles from my house to Kent Lake in less than 4 hours, but that wasn't my best time. My personal best is 8 hours and 15 minutes. That includes time resting with lizard sunning on the rock, writing down a dream remembered staring at Mount Barnaby, listening to woodpecker in the tree that harbors osprey's nest, wandering and listening in the unseen silence of my life. And patience isn't so much about waiting for something. That's basically impatience. The word Suzuki Roshi uses is constancy, an ability just to realize that we can be here now and present for what is. And you can feel it growing, with its ups and downs over the course of these days. But I know that as I became more constant in the monastery, I also was learning the constancy to be with my kid as a teenager, going through all those cycles, or to be in my marriage, or to be in the traffic jams in the Bay Area, which we have plenty of. That it's really the same game. What is it like to discover that we can live more and more in the reality of the present, in a timelessness that is here, and things come and go, we get caught in them, but that's not who we really are. Story. Someone left a retreat in Spirit Rock to fly back to where they lived, and she got to the airport, went in and got herself some reading material at the little airport shop and some cookies to eat, and then went to sit at the gate. Sitting there, put her stuff down, another guy sat down next to her in the chair on the other side of this little table. And then as she was sitting, he reached over and opened her bag of cookies. And fortunately, she'd been on retreat, so okay, took a deep breath. She looked at him. He smiled at her, opened it, and offered her a cookie. Okay, she took one. He smiled and took one too. And they sat there reading, and he kept taking them as she did. Finally, there's one cookie left in the bottom. He looked at it, smiled at her, took it out, broke it in half, offered her half of it. I mean, the nerve, right? She went through a lot. Then they called her plane, Gets on the plane, takes her stuff, seat belts in, gets settled, puts her purse under the seat. Then opens her purse to get out her reading material, and as she does, she looks inside, and her bag of cookies is in there. One of the things about patience is that we have all these stories about how they're doing it and who they're supposed to be and how it's supposed to happen. And again, returning to our true nature is to see this is the mind, the storytelling mind. Boy, if you haven't seen it in these days, I can't imagine that you haven't seen it. All the channels, 108 channels, all kind of empty. I mean, almost as bad as what's on the TV. It's true. So something begins to shift, and instead of taking time and struggle and so forth to be the reality, there comes the reality of here we are, and this other, points of view and so forth. We don't grasp them. Now with this, there also grows another of the sense of perfection, which is called determination. And that, is the quality of being able to be with what's beautiful, what's difficult, with what they say in the Tao, the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. To open to the whole play, the music of life. And I think about it in different ways. And the kind of determination is the determination of Rosa Parks to just stay in her seat. It's the determination of John Muir. There's a really amazing passage in John Muir's naturalist writings. He was in the Sierras and there was this huge storm coming up. And he said, I immediately got out of the cottage and went and climbed the highest ridge that I could. I scrambled to the summit of the highest ridge. And then it occurred to me what a fine thing it would be to climb one of the trees and obtain a wider outlook and get my ear close to the aeolian music of the whole forest in its glorious storm. And he climbed 150-foot Douglas spruce in the wildest storm in the Sierras and lashed himself to the top and described how the tree would make an arc of 20 and 30 degrees and what it was like a field of waving grain with the other trees, naked branches booming like waterfalls, exuberance of light and motion, the vibration of pine needles, the hiss, the whole music and the smell of it. That's determination. Okay, let's just stay where we are. In the midst of all of it, let us see what is possible. Because what we're learning here is not for us on retreat. Yeah, you can be a yogi and walk slowly, and, at one retreat center, the kids call us the Night of the Living Dead, right? It's not about that. It's about when you're ready to, when somebody you love is dying and they're frightened and they're in pain, and you can say, yeah, I know what it's like to sit with fear. I've done that. Great fear. I know what it's like to sit with pain. I know, and it's okay. You can hold their hand and say, I understand this. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who says, go with the pain, let it take you. Open your palms and your body to the pain. It comes in waves like a tide, and you must be open as a vessel, lying on the beach, letting it fill you up, and then retreating, leaving you empty and clear. With a deep breath, it has to be as deep as the pain. One reaches a kind of inner freedom from pain, as though the pain were not yours, but your body's. The spirit lays the body on the altar. And there is in our practice a growing capacity to be with this human incarnation in all its tainted glory, as Oscar Wilde would say, in all its measure of sorrows and all its beauty. And there comes with this a couple more factors. Truthfulness. Truthfulness is, who said it? Maybe it was Anna or Trudy or Gina in the talk about Mara. I see you, Mara. I see you. This is fear. Oh, bow to fear. Fear, fear. Whoops, it's getting worse. Oh, terror, terror. I feel like I'm dying, dying, dying. Wow, I'm doing pretty good. Pride, pride, and you just kind of, there it is. A truthfulness that can see what is so. A person can no more diminish the glory of the divine by refusing to acknowledge it than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling darkness on the walls of their cell. When we sit and we come back to who we really are, to this space of awareness that contains all things, allows all things, and yet is unmoved. Just let's take a moment. Try not to be aware. Try not to listen. Try not to hear these words. I'm not going to be aware. How far do you get? You can't do it, can you? Awareness is here. It's present now. And we begin more and more to trust this, and then to see from this place that we can bear the truth and that we can speak the truth. Martin Luther King, who says, I still believe that standing up for the truth is the greatest thing in the world. This is the end of life. The end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to live in a sacred way, come what may. And then I have to add to it a couple more things. Because I got a phone call yesterday from some friends who have come to Spirit Rock at different times, Julia Butterfly Hill and Joan Baez, who are sitting in a tree in south central Los Angeles, and they called to see if I knew some Buddhist monks and nuns who would come and chant and help them, because there's a whole big demonstration in South Central right now. There's the largest community green farm in a city in any place in the country is about to be sold by the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors to a developer, and it has 360 gardens of various campesinos and people who live in East Los Angeles. So this is from Cesar Chavez. He says, when we're really honest with ourselves, we have to admit that our lives are all that really belong to us. So it's how we use our lives that determines what kind of persons we are. It's my deepest belief that only by giving our lives to that which is true do we find life. I'm convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of humanity, is to sacrifice ourselves for something higher. To be human is to suffer for what we believe. God help us to be human. And so there's a kind of willingness, like Aung San Suu Kyi, that's asked of us to say, this is the way that it is. This is our measure of suffering. This is the hell that we have to go through. This is the beauty that we experience. This is the way that it is. Greed isn't the way. Hatred isn't the way. Perhaps one of the most important Dharma moments for me in learning from my own teachers came working in the Cambodian refugee camps with Mahagosananda, who is the Gandhi of Cambodia. Quite a wonderful man. He came and taught here. We brought him here to teach one of the 3-month retreats here years ago. Very dear friend. And then for 15 years, he did peace marches across Cambodia during the wartime. And people would grenade and shoot. And he would have, hundreds of monks and people with him. And he just kept walking peacefully in the midst of it all and doing metta prayers. So we were together in Sakeo and Khao Dang, which were a couple of the very large camps on the Cambodian border. and 50, 100,000 people. And then he got permission from the UNHCR, Refugee Commissioner. Let's make a Buddhist temple for the people, because their temples have burned, the village is destroyed. And so people came and built a kind of bamboo platform with a roof on top of it. And the day that the temple was supposed to open in the central courtyard, word had gone around the camp that this was going to happen. Sakeo had a lot of refugees from the Khmer Rouge, including underground. With them came a number of Khmer Rouge commandos. And the word that went around is, if anybody goes to that temple, when we get back to Cambodia, you will all be killed. And it was very serious because so many elders were killed, so much was destroyed. So we wondered who would come and how many people would come. And Gosananda and I and others went through the camp that morning, ringing a gong, traditionally inviting people to come to the temple. And at 10:30 in the morning, the gathering came. People began to gather. And 25,000 people filled the square. It's this huge sea. And then he got up there on this little bamboo platform with the Buddha. And then you could look out. I was with him, and these were people who were in shock, the kind of trauma of the terrible things that happen in the world. A grandfather and one niece or nephew or grandchild, an uncle and a couple of kids that remained. Everybody else had been killed, family destroyed. Holocaust. And I thought, all right, what is he going to say to this group of suffering humanity? And he sat for a while very quietly and then put his hands together. He was this very kind of gentle and beautiful spirit. Looked out across the crowds, a little bit of tears. And then he began to chant in Khmer or Sanskrit and in Cambodian. The words from the beginning of the Dhammapada: hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. And he chanted it over and over, and they hadn't heard, chanting, and they hadn't heard the sacred words for maybe 10 years. And pretty soon they started to chant with him, and after a while 25,000 people sitting there from this suffering, chanting, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. And it was as if he sat there and told a truth that was even bigger than their suffering. Yes, you've suffered incredibly, and even so, hatred will not cease by more hatred. This is the ancient and eternal law. And we sit here somehow to awaken to that truth that we know in ourselves. Metta and compassion are part of the perfections of the heart, as truthfulness is itself. And over in all these different ways, as we move about and encounter one another, or as we sit here, and memories of things that we've done that we feel shame about, or guilt about, or regret, or that we feel angry and betrayed about, because we've all been betrayed, every one of us as humanity. It's part of what happens. That somehow we learn the great heart of compassion, the capacity to offer our forgiveness to ourselves and to one another. This is a prayer that was written by an unknown prisoner in Ravensbrück concentration camp and found on a paper left by the side of a child who had died. Dear Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. And do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted on us alone, but remember too the fruits we have found thanks to this suffering: our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart which has grown out of all this. And when they come to judgment, let these fruits which we have borne also be a part of their mercy. Really almost unthinkable when one hears this. And yet, each in our own way, we are called upon. There are sufferings and struggles that we individually participate in and that we participate in as a collective of humanity. What spirit will we bring to them? And then the last factors are joy and equanimity. It's not just compassion and loving kindness, but there is a necessity, one of the factors of enlightenment. The Buddha said you cannot be awakened without also discovering the beauty and joy of life. André Gide writes, "Know that joy is rarer, more difficult, and more beautiful than sadness. Once you make this all-important discovery, you must embrace joy as a moral obligation." That suffering isn't enough, and the sorrows that we have and the suffering of the world, the Buddha said that suffering is the beginning of the path. But that joy, he was called the happy one, liberation, is the fruit of the path. Life is not a journey to the grave to arrive in a beautiful, artfully and well-preserved body, but rather to slide in broadside, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, what a ride." And one of the things that's important as you practice here in this shift of identity, when I speak about the loyalty to our suffering, is that there will be periods where ease comes, happiness comes, well-being, the gaps between our neurotic thoughts or our fears. It's really important to allow these, to inhabit them, to let them fill the cells of your body, not as a kind of attachment or a kind of let's paste it over and all smile and so forth, but from the very depth of being of this life that we've been given, this mysterious life. To me, probably the best poem I've read in a decade was Jack Gilbert's poem in the New Yorker called "A Brief for the Defense," and just a few lines from it. "We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit that there will be music despite everything." And whether it's the Dalai Lama carrying the sorrows of the people of Tibet, or Gosananda, or people that you know and love who are wise, or yourself, that bird is agreeing, right? There is in this life a beauty that is so central to our being. And we are light, we are filled with light. And it's not the light of some, kind of fantasy. It is the consciousness with which we are all illuminated. It is who we really are. There is, says Thomas Merton, in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fountain of action and joy and rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to us from the unseen roots of all creation. And we get quiet and take a walk in the woods or sit here in the morning light or the evening light as it fades, and there's this kind of rose color with the gray in the sky. And boy, if somebody said, you only have a few more days to live, would you drink that in? Say, it's not enough. I want more days of this. And with it comes a great peace of heart. The peace because we're not striving to be somewhere else, but the great equanimity to be without anxiety about the imperfections of the world. To see the whole of life, Hermes Trismegistus, the alchemical sage. He writes, "Perceive that you're not yet begotten, that you are in the womb, that you're young, that you're old, that you have died, that you're in the world beyond the grave. Grasp in your mind all of this at once, all times, and then you can begin to see with the eyes of the divine." And something in us knows this timelessness is where we come to rest. Often we confuse perfection with how to become perfect. You jog enough, treat your lover well, take enough vitamins, floss, a little more therapy, and you're going to be okay. Perfect your personality. Good luck, right? But this isn't really about that. The game is so much bigger, and at the same time, so much more intimate to who we really are. Ajahn Chah says we take refuge in the Buddha. What is this Buddha? When we see with the eyes of wisdom, we know that the Buddha is timeless, unborn, unrelated to any history. The Buddha is the ground of being, the truth of the unmoving mind. So the Buddha was never enlightened, not in India. He was never born, he never died. This timeless Buddha is our true home, our abiding place, our refuge. When we return to this, all things in the world are free for us. They become our teacher, proclaiming the one true nature of life. And this is the kind of blessing that the Buddha offers to those who practice. May you, as the Buddha says, may you find the joy, the freedom that I too have discovered. May you too find it. It's not, the Buddha had his own realization, and then he looked and said, you too can have your realization. And it's not in India, and it's not in the mountains, and it's not at the end of long retreats. It's always here when we remember, when we return. And you know it. Some part of you knows it as deeply as you know your own name. It's that close. And when we return, we become a gift to the world, which sorely needs it. And the troubled parts of the world, we don't need more oil and more energy and more anything. We need less greed, less hatred, less prejudice, less ignorance. That's what the world needs more than anything. And with the sense of who you are, you can return, it said, with gift-bestowing hands to your work, whatever it is, as a kindergarten teacher or a parent or a gardener or a person making an ethical business or a writer or an artist, whatever it happens to be, a politician, please. A blessing. So to end, it's a beautiful thing to come together and practice. And yes, your body gets released. You can feel it. Your faces start to shine. Your thoughts quiet down. All of these things happen. But also the invitation is something so big, to return to that great love and freedom that is who you are. Don't settle for anything less. A poem from Ngodup Paljor, a Tibetan poet writing in English. And it's a nice poem to read in New England. Robert Frost and I have one thing in common. He loves woods, and so do I. But there seems to be a big difference in the way we set forth in life's journey. He's a goer, and I'm a sitter. He has miles and miles to go before he sleeps, while I have years and years to sit to reach the same destination.